All right, we're rolling.
All right.
Yeah. So excited to talk to you, Derek. Uh,
Likewise, delighted to be here, Stephen.
yeah. So will you just share a little bit? We're just kind of, kind of getting to know each other. Share a little bit about your background and where you're coming from, and
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah. I was a philosophy major in college, and that got me really interested in the intersection of philosophy, medicine, and movement. And that led me into Chinese martial arts because it was the most coherent repositories of the coming together of these aspects of human culture that I could find. And yeah, I grew up relatively athletic. I'm not saying I was a great athlete, but I always loved sport. And I grew up playing ice hockey and things like that, lacrosse, ice hockey. And so I was used to some rough and tumble just by virtue of being exposed to those things. And when I got to college, and I guess I should also say, um, I went from being really interested in ice hockey when I was young to moving into windsurfing as I got older. And I became very obsessed with windsurfing, worked in sailboard shops, taught windsurfing from the time I was a young man. And so I've always been interested in activity and movement. When I got to college, I had to counterbalance my deviant behavior and just being a general knucklehead like a lot of kids do in school. And so I got into martial arts because I needed something to keep me going. And that coupled with studying philosophy really led me into this pathway of traditional Chinese martial arts and this idea of ultimately internal martial arts, because that's where a lot of the really cool stuff is, right? There's some really cool ideas and philosophies and coming together of things that that's what defines that space in a lot of ways. And so that got me fascinated with that. I've been very fortunate to travel, so I spent a lot of my younger days trying to find people to train with that I thought had the goods. And it certainly has been a long and humbling road, and realizing that there is something special and unique there, in my opinion. At the same time, one has to be able to separate the wheat from the chaff, and there's also a lot of people lost on the path, and been there myself. And I got really fortunate. So I lived in Asia for several years. I was pretty gung-ho about it. It was really what I did. And when I moved back from Asia, I was living in Boston. I'd been studying martial arts for about 15 years at this point. I'd trained in China, lived in Southeast Asia, and thought I was pretty good, thought I had something to teach. I was really into the yin style Bagua. I used to train with Xie Pei Qi and that group.
Oh, cool.
And I was introduced to a gentleman when I moved back to Boston who was a teacher of Xingyi Liu Hechen. And he had moved to Boston from Shanghai, and a mutual acquaintance connected us. And it was just good fortune. I had a healing practice on Newbury Street in Boston for many years, so I was able to sort of set my own schedule. This gentleman had time because he had come to the States to work. This was right when the economy crashed, right? He was working building windows. He lost that job, so we were able to get together on a daily basis for years and train. And so he really took me under his wing, but it all started with kind of somebody saying, you don't really know what you're doing, and I was like, what do you mean? I know what I'm doing. I've been to China, goddammit, and so it was sort of a bitter pill, right? I was confronted with the
Right.
idea that I had to either accept what he was saying and reconsider what I thought I understood, or walk off in a puff thinking he didn't know what he was talking about. But it was clear to me that he knew what he was talking about, right? So basically I had to redefine all my terms and really get a sense of what do I mean by these things. And it was a great experience because he didn't speak a lot of English and I don't speak a lot of Chinese. We both knew enough to have a communication, and I've spent enough time living in countries where I didn't speak the language to have some skill with charades, if you will, or the ability to communicate non-verbally.
Right.
And so yeah, it just became a great relationship, and I really got to be taught in a really clear and methodical way by this gentleman. And so that really changed everything for me. And so my fascination ever since has been this distinction between internal and external. Now, to me, martial arts gets in the way of learning martial arts.
Hmm.
You know, I kind of think martial arts is to fighting like cooking is to eating. You can love to eat and not be a good cook, and you can love to cook and not eat well, you know. And with martial arts, it's I know people, again, I grew up playing ice hockey and I grew up near a fishing town, and I know people that can fight. They just have been tough and they like to fight and they know how to fight. They never thought about it. They never learned anything about it. So you can have the capacity and not have the knowledge, but when you have the two come together, that's something really special. And so for me, the body method, the ability to change the human physicality so that you have a capacity to do certain things is what's really interesting in the internal martial arts. Again, I'm not saying it translates into being able to beat everybody up. I'm just simply saying it develops a very interesting type of physicality. And, you know, I'm almost 50 years old, and I can say that I move better and feel more comfortable and more relaxed in my body than I ever have. And, so to me, that's the value. That's what I'm pursuing and trying to extract from these practices and put into digestible pieces for people. And when I look around the landscape of movement and fitness, yeah, I think there's a lot of stuff that needs to be articulated and redefined. And so my whole journey is in trying to get clearer on some of these distinctions and ideas and bring forth a method that helps people with this development. And so that's really what I'm keen at. That has led me into the club swinging, which has become a big part of my practice and teaching now. And yeah, I love it. You know, for me, there's just a real joy in movement and expressing oneself physically. And I think at the same time, there are greater and lesser practices, and there are distinctions we can make. And a lot of the challenge in the traditions is that they are meticulous, and people don't like to be checked or put into constraints, but the constraints create the pressure that leads to the development. So yep. It's a dance, right? How do you not tell people they're wrong, at the same time try to get them to move in a different direction that leads them toward perhaps more fruitful pastures?
Yeah. A lot of, I didn't want to interrupt you, but there's like 20 things I could talk about what you just said. I'm going to, just for the sake of cohesion, I'm going to jump way back to the beginning when you were talking about, you know, I studied philosophy as well, some formally, but, you know, I've always been a philosopher, for better or worse.
Yeah, had
you know?
the disposition,
Yeah, and studied philosophy in school for a bit. And when I was in school for Chinese medicine, which I don't do acupuncture, I spent 3 semesters in a school studying Tuina.
Nice.
And you know, I just would say I'm here because Chinese medicine is applied Taoist philosophy. You know,
Right.
like what I was really most interested in was the Taoist philosophy underneath it, and then you know, and then that led to some understandings. That was before I knew anything about the Cultural Revolution, and so you know, things get a little funny with all that. But very much like you, like, yes, I'm interested in things, but I'm really interested in what's underneath the things. You know, the same goes with movement, and you know, whether it's martial arts or movement itself. Like, completely agree with you. I mean, the main reason I do any of it is for joy, which is, you know, I remember the first time I stood up in front of a room of experienced martial artists and was like, I only do this practice because it brings me joy, you know. And I was like, are they going to laugh at me? And they were all like, actually, yeah. I mean, sometimes joy is punching your friend in the face, but it's you know, that's the bottom line. It's about quality of life, and like you say, moving better, and you know, and those practices. I mean, the Chinese internal arts are certainly known for this, but there are practices not exclusive to them that will help you keep going into longevity. And then there's practices that are great for teenagers, and you know, you may want to give those up by the time you're 40. You know,
I mean, that. Sorry to interrupt, but it leads me to the sort of the crux of the matter, or what interests me is I'm fascinated by this idea that there's a whole different way of thinking of using and developing the body. And so with the Chinese idea, you're leading the energy and blood deeper into the body than just the muscle belly. And so that is a concept, and the fruit it creates is just different. And I'm not saying one is better or worse than, but like our model in the West has so much to do with building muscles to develop strength rather than postural strength, which is the coherency of the organization of the whole structure itself. And so for me, that fascinates me. And then any art, as far as I'm concerned, is a collection of training methods. And so certain lineages and traditions have some really good training methods. And lineage is only useful if you're good, because all it says is what you've had access to. And so it's really, you know, I feel really lucky to have two teachers that I study with who both have very clear and direct lineage and both have incredible skills. So for me, it's like the skill is what draws me to it, but also knowing that, okay, there's like no gap from person to person here. And so the definition of the terms that we use are all clearly explained physically, rather than, you know, Chinese martial arts, especially the internal arts, people are saying all kinds of shit they're not doing. And so that's where the rubber doesn't meet the road. There has to be an embodied understanding of what the idea is. And so that is, I think, really special and part of what I'm hoping to preserve from the standpoint of, you know, I've studied a lot of things around health and movement to try to understand Chinese martial arts. And I still feel like a guy who's lost his wallet. I just know I didn't leave it at the restaurant and I didn't leave it at my friend's house. It's somewhere in my own house and I'm still looking for it, right? It's a constant upgrading of your definitions of what you know, because your body changes and then all of a sudden something means something different and it becomes more intimate and clear.
I get a lot of that. And it's interesting, again, just to back up, because there's a lot of juicy stuff that I'd love to run with. But even what you were saying about, I mean, this is something that it's nice to be able to talk to you about, because even what you're saying about how Western physical culture, and even through, you know, whether that's physical therapy or just the Western biomechanical model, you know, I mean, that's a very specific way of looking at the body, you know, and there's, and it's very different than Chinese in general, Asian in general, Chinese in particular, and Chinese internal in real particular is a very different way of looking at how the whole thing works together. You know, and then we run into problems with terminologies, different lineages. We use the same terms to mean slightly different things because it's kind of a whole universe in a sense, or, you know, there's a lot of different ways of interpreting things. But even with, you know, a lot of I mean, even just how we use muscle, and like you said, the concept of strength, you know, and the West is waking up now to, oh, strength doesn't just mean giant biceps or, you know, big hypertrophic muscles in isolation, you know, like, oh, I mean, the West is waking up way more, and there's a lot of the, you know, more modern practices that a lot of folks you and I know are involved in are much more in alignment with, you know, whole body practices, but our whole concept of strength and what that even means, you know, and it's not that you can, I mean, someone can bodybuild and they objectively have strength, you know, but it's a different type of strength, you know, than a long-term Tai Chi player, for example. You know, it's a very different type.
And this is where, to get back to the philosophy, right? It's like Socrates saying that the beginning of wisdom is the defining of terms, right? So it's like, you know, one of the first experiences I had with my teacher was just the basic idea of what to do with the tailbone. What do you do with your coccyx? You know, you can read any book on Tai Chi and this and that, and they say, oh, you have to tuck the tailbone a little bit. Or, you know, there's people that would refute that and say, oh, it's supposed to be straight. You know, there's a lot of back and forth and all these things. But I thought I had been tucking my tailbone until my teacher said, no, this is what tucking your tailbone is, and physically put me into a position. And so something I thought I had been doing, and I had language to describe what I thought I was doing, was not the defined experience of what that means within the tradition. And so it's like, this is where there's so much ambiguity, is that people can have an idea of something and, oh yeah, we do that too. But it's like, yeah, but that's not what I'm talking about, you know? And it's challenging because, to be honest, it's like push hands. For me, push hands is a very specific game. It has very clear definitions, and it's used for a very specific purpose. If you're not doing that, to me, I'd rather grapple. It's like when push hands becomes this halfway between submission grappling and halfway between push hands, it feels kind of pointless to me. And so my point is that to have agreed upon terms that you are training allows you to be training together toward a goal. But when the communication isn't clear, it can really create murky waters. And so a lot of what happens in practice is that there is this lack of clarity. And so yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. I spent a lot of time really immersed in the world of Chinese martial arts, and it's both beautiful and grotesque at the same time. It's my favorite thing in the world. At the same time, I'm kind of loath to talk to anybody that's into Tai Chi or Chinese martial arts, right? It can be a tough conversation, and it's because of the lack of clarity on definitions and terms.
Because you guys will be talking about using the same words and meaning different concepts.
Yeah, exactly. And so, to me, all of this comes down to what I would call classical education and number and principle. And so a lot of what I recognize now when I look at Chinese martial arts is they actually, and so I do a healing art called Jin Shinjitsu, which is a Japanese form of body work, very similar to Chinese medicine in some ways, but we use fingers instead of needles. But Jin Shinjitsu is an art of number and principle. We have a map of the body based on numbers, and those numbers represent principles, and therefore they have roles within the body based on the number and the principle. And so when you study Chinese martial arts, you have this same thing. The Liuhe and Xingyi Liuhe is the Six Harmonies. And so this idea of six is a number of balance and unification is a natural thing that we see out there in the world. This is the energy of the number six. And so there's a crossover between these two things. And that fascinates me. And this goes back to the old Platonic ideas of, geometry is the substrate of all reality that manifests in physical form. You can't get away from it. Things organize in terms of geometry. And so the body is an object in space. And so we are governed by those same rules. And so a lot of training and practice, pardon me, I've had a bit of a head cold, comes down to reorganizing the body by getting rid of the self-created tension that pull us out of our natural design. And so a lot of it, like healing, is an undoing. We're trying to learn to recognize the things we are doing that are causing us to close in on ourselves. Tension's an activity, right? So we have to recognize the doing of it to be free of it.
Right. Yeah. I'm often fond of saying we have to undo the doing. And, and sometimes that gets a little specific person to person.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then within the kind of the internal arts perspective, there's the doing, the undoing, and then undoing the doing, and then there's the not doing.
Right.
It's like, how do I not be the thing that's actually generating force? How do I let gravity or momentum or mass be what propels my arm instead of muscular effort? Which jumped a little bit into a tangent there, but it's all related.
I mean, really what we're talking about is learning to make distinctions, right? And so in a lot of ways, the challenge in learning one of these arts is that there's a huge discipline in doing less and learning to make distinctions so you have clarity on things. And so, for me, a lot of what I do in my teaching and in my work is to extract these ideas and put them into simplest terms. So the human body only does three things: flexion, extension, and rotation, right? There's, 700, 800 muscles. People debate it, but all you need to understand is three movements. And if you can simplify it and recognize there's only three planes of motion: frontal, sagittal, rotational.
Right.
Three is a principle, the Trinity. Right. Everything that exists has three components to it: the 3 and 1 and the 1 and 3. So this is what I mean by number and principle. And so when we study these numbers and principles, we're not confined by saying, well, this is your bicep attachment, it does this. It's a much more vague and therefore bigger consideration than getting literal about, well, if you just use this muscle or strengthen this and that. There's a holistic aspect to it and a organizational aspect to it that is based on these numbers. And number is, again, classical education, the old way of teaching and thinking, you have this idea of a trivium and a quadrivium, right? The trivium is the method, which Chinese martial arts, in my opinion, are classical education. And this is where the number and principle are still found within these arts. But the trivium is the how you do it, the method. And you have basically grammar, which is the phase of amassing information and material around a subject. Then logic, where you go through that material you've gathered and you work through the inconsistencies. And then rhetoric, the ability to speak about it because you've done the first two phases and you can demonstrate your knowledge. What you study are number, arithmetic, number in space, geometry, number in time, music, and number in time and space, which is the movement of the heavenly bodies, the cosmology or the planetary movements, which have been happening as long as there have been people. And before there was TV, that's what people looked at, So like, we are that, as above, so below, these kind of ideas, to me, are really profound truths that we have to poke at and poke at and poke at to begin to get some kind of understanding over. But as we go through the process, this has at least been my experience, things show up and all of a sudden it's like, that's what that means. And you just get a little more of a hit on it and you get more clarity in the direction you're moving in. And it just becomes this sort of self-affirming process where you develop number 9, knowing, discernment, recognizing. And so like there's this constant growth and movement. And because we're talking about things that you can never actually get to the end of, there's no harmonies or pursuit. You never get there. Like math, a half of a half of a half of a half goes on forever. So these are things that we can't actually attain, but the pursuit of it moves us closer toward the correct.
Nice. I like that was wonderful. I really appreciated hearing you talk about the trivium and quadrivium. And it's interesting because I appreciate how much language and structure you focus on, because I'm actually quite quite the opposite in a lot of ways. I often don't have the words for things that I do or things that I've studied. And I love jumping into the chaos and seeing what emerges. And then you find, these same patterns keep emerging, like, these same 3 planes of motion. Let me just focus on these. I spent a couple years really obsessed with exactly that. And what are the simplest fundamental movements I can make to accomplish, really everything, especially if it's whole body connection.
That's right. Yeah.
If the whole body's doing it, there's only really so many there's only a few things it does,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And a lot of this, for me, the words have come out of the process from the standpoint of, you have to dive into the chaos. You have to go into that knowing or that not knowing so that you can begin to pull these things out. And what I'm appreciating more and more is that, I didn't make any of this up. These are living traditions. And as far as I'm concerned, as long as there have been people, they've always wanted to get stronger and to be healthy. So health is not a new consideration, nor is strength. So we imagine that, hey, we've arrived at the modern world. Now we have the answer to these things. Come on. One of the things that was really profound for me in living in Asia was spending time up country and seeing people that were just in their 80s and just incredibly fit and healthy and, the whole peasant virility kind of thing that is a real thing because these are people living in their bodies. We've all become so educated these days that everybody is analyzing everything and there's no embodying of these things. And so for me, I think this is, not to get into the chaos of the world, but this is what the underpinning is. And so what's really needed is this medicine of self-reliance and recognizing that we are here in these bodies. And if we don't, I think it's a truism to say that when you're thinking, you're not feeling. And when you're feeling, you're not thinking. They don't happen in the same space. we've all become so used to thinking constantly that our feeling awareness is atrophied. And one of the single greatest gifts, I think, to humanity that the Chinese internal arts have to offer is that they put the introception, the feeling presence before everything else. You can learn how to fight quickly and easily if you're a person predisposed to fighting. If you're not, it's probably going to be a bitter road to get there, right? And it's probably not where you should be going anyway. But the usefulness of the practices is in developing these less visible aspects of our being and having a tradition that the practices grow out of. You know, like for my teacher, it's an oral tradition. He's got his little book that he drew and wrote down as a kid from his teacher telling him the songs of the art and the whole thing. And so it's like, it's a thing. It's not debatable. You know, it's not like, well, maybe, no, this is what it means. This is the song. Like, we'll be training together and he'll just start talking in Chinese to remember because it's all rhyming songs. Oh, here, boom, there it is. And so it's like, that's a beautiful connection to human knowledge. And a lot of, you know, we're constantly reinventing the wheel, right? Where people are like, a lot of technology is a nonlinear progression. Okay, we have an electric car key that starts the car without having to put it in, but we already knew how to start a car. You know, we didn't need to go there. So a lot of what we're doing is wasting time in these kind of recursions or new ways of doing things that we can already do. So a lot of really valuable information, in my opinion, is hidden in these traditions. It's just, it takes some time of looking at them to actually get what it means, because it's a different culture, it's a different consideration. And when you're working at the body from the Eastern standpoint, you're developing tendon, blood, and bone, not muscle. So it's totally different. So a lot of people will try and say, well, I'm going to lift weights for this and then do my Tai Chi to be soft and da-da-da. I'm going to create an integrated thing. But integration isn't taking three different things and saying you're doing them all. Integration is knowing what connects them. And so this to me is body method, Shinfa in Chinese. That is what interests me, is seeing the quality of somebody's movement, what they're able to do with that movement, and how it leads toward more ease and balance and harmony within an individual.
Yeah. Yeah. And like you were saying, part of the challenge in learning these practices, you know, especially, I mean, specifically thinking about the Chinese internal arts, but anything that relies that heavily on interoception and from a you know, the cultural context is different. You're literally learning how to perceive the world differently. You're learning how to perceive your body differently. You're learning how to feel and interpret sensations differently. And that's part of the fun and frustration of the whole path as well, is suddenly I feel a whole mess of things that I don't even have names for, you know, and I'm not even sure what they mean, you know. And then part of the fun in push hands, for example, is, I mean, there's a lot of fun things, but some of them are, you know, what just happened, and then learning to perceive the things that used to happen quicker than I could perceive, or I was too tense to feel what was going on in my body, you
Right.
know, and little by little, it's like time slows down, and you learn to interpret sensations differently, and then you learn the meaning from them. Oh, you know, this vector means do this thing, you know,
Right,
and
right.
you know, your body learns to interpret the geometry on an instantaneous level. There's a whole other, um,
Becomes conversational, right? The body starts to
yes,
have the ability to recognize what's being asked of it. And as an individual, you get out of the way and you simply watch what's happening. And
yeah,
it's profound. And in a lot of ways, it's metaphorical for life, right? We don't want to be in the river. We want to be on the bank of the river watching things happen, right? It's creating space. I'll often tell people that having a body is a little bit like being given a piece of land in the woods. You need to go out and clear the trees of where you're going to build the house. We need to clear the space of the body if we're going to bring our attention awareness back into the body. So much of what happens is we get strung so tight that we can't feel our body because it's an uncomfortable thing to feel. So we stay more and more in our head. And so, like anything worth pursuing, it's a uphill climb at first. It kind of sucks, right? It's like, I've got to own this. You know, that was like when I met my teacher, it's like, okay, I had to own that I spent 15 years. It wasn't wasted time, but I didn't have clear definitions. I didn't really know what I was doing, even though I thought I knew. And so that's very humbling and can be bitter, but at the same time, it's liberating, because all of a sudden, all right, you get to start over and you get to build things on clear definitions if you're lucky enough to get them provided for you. And so I think a lot of what these practices have opportunity to bring to people is a reconsideration. And, it's like Heraclitus said, it's impossible to teach someone that which they think they already know, right? So we all get to come back to zero and build it back up and recognize that, standing straight, it's a skill. It's an art. And most people, 99% of the population, can't do it. So we worry about doing all these complex, intense movements, but it's like, well, how's your posture? How's your muscle tone? Are you relaxed? Are you aligned? I'm a big advocate on simple things. So to me, it's like stand in the bones, move through the joints, and lead with the mind. How do we do this? In internal martial arts, we have Ting, Song, and Yi. I have to be able to feel my body clearly enough to recognize the tension. And this gets back to the trivium. This is the method. 1, take stock of what's there. Feel the body. 2, recognize the tension, the inconsistencies. 3, you begin to express yourself more clearly because you've cleared away the confusion in the body and the nervous system, which is what tension is. And so it becomes this process that it's a concurrent but self-generating spiral. Each layer you go deeper leads you further up. And like a scale that's really sensitive will measure a very light load. This is how sensitivity works. We start to be able to notice things that we didn't have a clue were happening before because we've trained ourselves to pay attention.
Yes.
Yeah.
I enjoy listening to you talk because you are very
Thank you.
clear and your terms are very well defined, and I tend to be a bit vague. I'm better with concepts than words, so I actually really appreciate hearing the way you're breaking this down.
Thank you.
And it's interesting for me because you're talking about things that I have experience with, and I'm like, oh, that's familiar, right? I know that, but most of my teachers weren't really. That wasn't their predilection. They weren't good with words.
I was really blessed. I mean, I've studied with a lot of people over the last 30 years. I have 2 people who I consider to be my teachers, who I continue to study with and who I've spent many years with. But it's hard. It's hard to get the right relationship. It's hard to get the right understanding of what's being offered. That there's a lot of variability in what somebody can walk away with, and And if I'm honest, a lot of it has also been that I've persevered. I've been fucking trying to figure this out for a long time. And so bringing that contemplation, right? Sitting with it and wondering what it is, that's part of the process. And, for me, the structuring is for me, it's very clear, but because a lot of people were trained in the Western mind to think a certain way, we want complexity, right? So like I look at the numbers, and numbers 1 through 3 have to do with the physical body. 4 through 6 have to do with the mental body. 7 through 9 have to do with the spiritual body. Mind, body, and spirit are distinctions within the same event based on different layers of density or levels of density. So you start with the grossest, the physical body. 1, you have to unify the body. How do you unify the body? You unify the body by bringing the head and tail into opposition. So you stretch and lengthen the whole spine. This connects the body up. The second principle is separating the opposites. You have a front and a back, a left and a right, a top and a bottom. You have yin tissue and yang tissue. You have to make these distinctions so you're aware of them. And then number 3 is integration. You have to take the things you've separated and bring them together. In the classics, it says you separate the parts to unify the whole. So there's this process. So the integration of number 3 leads to the physical structuring of the number 4. 4 is about manifestation, shape, and form. 5 is about vitality, chi. When you get the body organized into the right shape, the energy starts to fill into the body because you've emptied it by clearing out the tension. So where there's emptiness, there will be fullness. And then you have 6, which is harmonization. 7 is the victory of having done the 1 through 6. Then you have 8, which is recognizing as above, so below. And then 9 is knowing, the discernment that comes from the whole process, spiritual awareness. So it's like a cute little package, but it holds a lot of information, right? It's a loose enough definition that we get to play within it, but it's clear because there are things, and it becomes clearer as you work with it more and more. But so, yeah, I mean, my thing is, because I've always been philosophically oriented from the time I was a kid. I had really strong dyslexia, so I'm not a very linear thinker. I'm not great with writing things out and all this kind of stuff. I'm conceptual. And so a lot of this for me is about having exercises that are very specific and clear, because the communication is this bigger philosophical kind of thing that you just have to hear over and over and over. But my experience with learning from my teachers is just that. Like, I'll go see my teacher now, and we don't even train. I just have tea with them. I go back, my training is totally different. Nice. You know, it's like layers of understanding that you arrive at the ability to be ripe for because of the process. So I think that is also part of the challenge, because everybody's in a hurry and everybody's got limited time. And so people want, no, what is it? What is it? But as soon as you try and put it in that kind of a box, you limit it, and it becomes less than it is. There's a perpetual journey of being in a body, because the body is always changing. And so it's like health. It's not a static thing. You're not either healthy or not healthy. You're moving in a direction. And so that, I think, is imperative for people to grasp, to be able to really move toward the direction of pursuing their own harmony, which we're always just in pursuit of.
Yeah. And interesting, makes me think about just that balance of, I mean, there's order and chaos, and then there's structure and adaptability, you know, and having both of those things. It's like, I remember there's actually a Wing Chun book that I read years ago, but it said a kung fu without a system is not a kung fu, but a kung fu locked into its own system is not a kung fu, you know. Right. And it's finding that balance between having the structure and having the adaptability. You know, sometimes you got to jump into the chaos and see what emerges, and be disoriented in order to even understand how important navigation is, you know. Right. But then you also want to know where the 4 corners are. You know, you want to know which way is north. You want to, you That's know, right. and so, I appreciate
paradox, right? We live at paradox. You're not your body, but you're also not your body.
Right.
So it's like, it's an important part of the journey, you know? Yeah. And so being able to embrace that paradox and be comfortable with it, and recognizing, you know, so Tai Chi is a great example. Everybody is attracted to it because they want to flow. It looks so flowing, but you don't flow into flowing. The flowing that comes from Tai Chi is based on structure. If you don't have a structured container, you can't release into anything, right? You need something to release into, just like the liquid in this cup would be all over the place without the cup.
Right.
So we need the shape. We need the organization of the structure and the principles to have something to organize around. And so it's just this constant back and forth between these ideas of structure and freedom and creativity, but also creating off of a base, right? It's like, learn the art before you better the art.
Right. Yeah. And you have to learn the rules before you can bend the rules. Some rules can be bent, some can even be broken, but you have to know what they are first, you know?
That's right. Yeah. And order is the first law of life, right?
Yeah.
Everything comes out of the chaos through order.
Yeah.
So order has to be acknowledged, and it's a paradox, but it's true, right? Control leads to freedom.
Yeah, it is a paradox. still constantly looking at that one for myself, actually. You know, sometimes internal discipline prevents external discipline.
That's right. Yeah.
But you know, even it's interesting, even just with the interpretations of these things. It's like I've also got 2 people that I would really credit with my kind of internal understanding of things. One I learned the form from and continue to push hands with. The other's more of an uncle. You know, didn't learn him system, but he just beats me regularly, and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
um, you
Always
know,
good to have.
always good to have. So my relationship with him has actually been great for me, because I have a bit of authority issues, and so I crave
Hmm.
structure, but
Hmm.
then I rebel against the structure. And
Yeah,
so
I feel you there.
he's been my uncle. Like, he never stopped me and told me do it like this, or it'd be better if you did this. He would just punch me in the face till I figured out how not to let him. He'd toss me off my feet till I figured out how not to let him. And
Yeah,
so I learned a lot of it sideways,
yeah, yeah.
but when I could formulate the questions, I could ask the questions, and he'd always be honest with me.
Hmm. Hmm.
But it's interesting, just having these two people that um, have legitimate internal skill, and that I've gotten to train with regularly, and they have different skills.
Hmm.
They
Hmm.
you know they train with each other as well, so there's overlap, and they've
Yeah,
grown more to each, because they've learned to counter each other's skills, but they came from having different interpretations of it, and even hearing about some of their the elders that they knew, like, for instance, the word like sync the chi,
mm,
that means a lot of different things to different people.
yeah,
Um, and and again, the proof's in the pudding. Well, if they're skilled, then how are you syncing the chi?
yeah.
But I know, I've heard stories about, I'm forgetting the fellow's name, but there was one of the Iron Shirt guys, you know, have people drive cars over him. People, how do you do that? Sync the chi.
Right.
Okay, that's a slightly different interpretation than but it's like, so sometimes I wonder how much, because there are clear paths, there are clear methods you can follow, just like a recipe. Add this, add this, add this, cook for
Hmm.
this long, boom. And then sometimes it's like, just look here. What am I looking for? Just look. It's
Yeah,
like going out in the woods, and you may not know what I'm going to, this cool rock outcropping I found, but I may not know what I'm going to find there, and
right, right.
I might go there and on a different day from somebody else and have a whole different experience. And so, when people get really focused on, for example, the Dantian, you know, there are some commonalities, but people sometimes people find different things.
Sure, yeah. And the map is not the territory, but the
Sure.
map you have will determine what you're apt to see because you'll be
Mm,
looking for it.
right.
And so it's important to have a good map. And so, you know, a lot of um, a lot of these ideas and buzzwords, right? Dantian and sinking the chi, all these things are, you know, I have my definitions of them. For me, sinking the chi is the result of creating the conditions that allow the body to organize and align so you can actually let go of tension. And then what happens is things tend toward their own level, right? So the
Right.
heaviness of the body descends downward. And so there's a ability to consolidate, because again, we have these macro patterns like flexion and extension. So if you bring your whole body into a flexed pattern, but a balanced flexed pattern, and you maintain that over time, you're building the connection of that shape. And so
Hmm.
you wind up having the ability to be in a position or form a shape that is balanced and organized through the internal alignments. So Chinese martial art is an art of making shape. It's shape shifting. Xing Liu He literally means integrating the heart and the mind through the 6 harmonies and the 10 big shapes. So every one of these shapes has its requirements, but it's not about the external shape, or, like it's like, yoga is an easy thing to, I don't mean to be disparaging, but it's a great example of people copying shapes without any internal content, and nobody, for the most part, knowing what they're doing, and all these injuries arising out of just simply repeating things. In my opinion, and in the arts that I practice, every one of these shapes has its own series of internal alignments and way of organizing. And it's in the repetition of the act that you begin to bring these things online. And then the old pulling silk idea, where at first it's delicate, it's just a single thread, but over time it gets thicker and thicker and thicker. And so if you have two people, and this is where push hands is a useful practice, if two people are both pushing hands and one has more gong or more development the other, they'll win every time, because you're doing the same thing. It's like two people going for the ball. And if you and I both go for the ball every time, and you're bigger, faster, stronger, more athletic than me, you're going to get the ball. I may get it every once in a while, but likely not even. And so what happens though, is by playing with somebody who bests you every time, you get better and better and better. And that relative gap will be there as long as it is, you know? And so part of it is in being okay with staying within the confines of what the game is and losing, rather than changing the confines of the game to try to not lose, you know? And that's a challenge.
That is a challenge, and it's a really important thing.
And losing is the wrong word. Sorry. You know, there is no, but you know what I'm talking about. It's
Oh,
like,
I know what you're talking about. Yeah. There's a saying in the game Go. Well, I was told, try to lose your first 50 games as fast as possible. You know,
right.
and I think that's a great attitude. You know, and you know, I remind myself with that. Like I'll try new things that I suck at, and it's like, well, if I want to get good, just keep losing. You know,
That's right. Yeah.
and be cool with losing. You know, and one of the beautiful things about push hands, and you know, sometimes I try to explain this to people. You know, it's a because a lot of martial artists from different backgrounds look at that and they're like, that just they don't get it, you know. And it's like,
Yeah.
there's a lot there, and people do different ways. There's a lot of things that can be gained from that for sure. But one of the things that's beautiful to me about it is it's a very low consequence loss.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know,
Absolutely. Well said.
if we're pushing and you beat me 20 times in a row, I should still have all my teeth. I should still have a functioning nose. You know, like, it doesn't matter. I've moved my foot. Who cares? You
Yeah.
know, and then you can focus on the other things. Okay, what if I just want to stay relaxed? You know, and
Right.
you know, et cetera, et cetera. You know, there's skills you can work on. There's principles you can work with, and
Yeah. And that's, to me, part of the reason it's a good container. You can pick an attribute and develop it. And in a lot of ways, to me, it's like tennis, right? It's if you're better than someone at tennis and you're a lot better, you can just simply hit every ball so they can't return it. But that's no fun for either person. So what do? You hit it just to the edge of where they can go so they can get it back. And then you've got a nice rally volley. I don't know what it's called, going back and forth. And so like push hands should be the same. It's this idea of, oh, I got you. I got your edge. Oh, good. Got your edge. And so you're constantly getting taken beyond where you're comfortable. So your brain has to recalibrate and find it. And at the end of the day, and this goes back to sort of what I was saying about simplicity, you know, there's 3 movements we can do: flexion, extension, rotation. There's 3 planes of motion: sagittal, frontal, rotational. And there's 3 reflexes: fear, startle, fear, excitation, and rotating away from trauma. So like the human body has this design and it has its way of doing things. The nervous system controls the muscular system. The muscular system controls the skeletal system. So postural issues are a function of neuromuscular tension. You're being pulled out of alignment by an activity you're subconsciously doing. So we have to learn to feel that happening to desist in sending the signal that's organizing the pattern. So there's this whole need to develop this feeling awareness to really free our body of the tension. And I'm of the opinion that the tension is the obstacle. It is the obfuscation of the brain from having a lay of the land. And so when we clear the tension, the brain, by virtue of the nervous system, gets to reinstate itself throughout the body. And this is like tuning a musical instrument. You're just better and better and better and better. There's no end. You know, even master musicians are still trying to hit the perfect C chord on a guitar, right? It just has no end, but doesn't mean it's not glorious to pursue it.
Yeah. And I mean, and so with that, you know, I mean, there's the physical patterns and the physical tension patterns, and then there's the psycho-emotional, spiritual, however you want to phrase it, you know, in those patterns. And like you said, I mean, the art of shape-shifting. And when we work with these different patterns, and when we clear blockages and clear habitual tensions, It's like, oh, my whole experience of existing is different, you know.
Yeah,
We
yeah,
don't have to be locked in this, that way or the other, you know. And then part of the trick is to be able to adopt a shape and not get locked there, you know, and then
that's
adopt,
right. Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, so stability and change,
Mhm.
and that is all about geometry and relationship, and one thing be able to change out of what it is, but into a new stable shape, you know. And so a lot of that process is one of building, right? To release tension, you have to engage it. You can't give away what you don't have. And so a lot of the challenge in internal arts is everybody comes out to try and be soft right away. Oh, I'm using too much power. My teacher would say, you can't do it hard enough yet. Don't worry about relaxing, like stand,
Mm.
you know, in a position you don't have the strength yet to think about the relaxation phase. Now that doesn't mean go to the gym and weight lift. That means, so posture, in my opinion, is a form of sustained mindfulness.
Mhm.
You learn to feel your body clearly enough to take the oppositional forces, to take the slack out of the body, so that you're actually building a shape and you're maintaining that shape through your physical awareness of your body. So you have a sustained mindfulness through a set intention. That grows like a muscle, so that you're then able to move and change without ever having a break through the frame and structure of the body by virtue of feeling or listening for it. That, excuse me, the not breaking is of more importance than the outcome. So that is how you shift your priorities. So you're actually training and listening to not what people see so much as your internal sense of the body. And like with push hands or something, the reason you don't want to lean or brace or get into this other stuff is because it's not in the same place with the skill you're trying to develop. You're
Mhm.
trying to learn to not do that. So
Yeah.
every time you do that, you've given in to the thing you're trying to not do, rather than simply accept the push out or whatever it is from maintaining the conditions that you're trying to strengthen. The more you maintain the conditions you're trying to strengthen and put them under pressure, the stronger they'll become.
There's a quote from the classics, or one interpretation of the classics.
Yeah, right.
Right. But it's, and I'll butcher it anyway, so it doesn't matter. But we restrict the movements in order to illustrate the principles. But once the
Hmm.
principles are understood, then any movement can be filled with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, I find, one of the biggest challenges in teaching movement to folks in the way that I want to, is that everybody wants to do too much.
Mhm.
And if something's complicated and there's a lot going on, there's chances are that there's a lot being missed. If a
Mhm.
practice is simple and doesn't have too much going on, it gives you a chance to really notice what's going on. So we have to pare things down to the simplest form to really get the idea. And then we have to try to build that up into more complex patterns and ways of playing it without losing the idea. So for me, club swinging is a great example. When I teach clubs, I'm really teaching posture. And I often will say that the swinging of the club, it's like if you and I are in a car driving down the road, we can have a conversation and I want to listen and participate in the conversation. But if I allow the conversation to become of if I allow the conversation to take my attention off of the road, so I crash the car, that's not good for either of us. In swinging the club swinging is the conversation. The posture is the road. As soon as I lose my alignment and my posture due to the swinging, I have to come back to the posture, because there's priority, there's an order of operations there. And so Chinese martial arts, this idea of internal connection, is the same thing. As soon as I lose that connection, so I'm no longer pulling through the whole body,
Mhm.
I can't develop what I want unless I go back to pulling through the whole body. So there's a real need to become disciplined and somewhat self-critical, which is also a tough thing, right? Because you're learning to make distinctions and discerning what's incorrect. You have to go through your whole process and find your errors. And you know, everybody today wants everything to be bubbles and flowers and stuff, and so it's hard to, you have to have a certain degree of being willing to stand corrected.
You got to eat bitter. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
there's no way around it. You got to eat some
that's
bitter.
true.
You
Yeah.
know, and I remember my the fellow that taught me the Chen Manqing form, a man named Brent Neely. is one of the guys I still push hands with. But
Mhm.
I had studied a lot of arts from a lot of teachers and had gotten used to and comfortable and even craved correction. Um,
Mm,
but I didn't know how to self-correct.
mm,
Not in my solo practice. I mean, when you're sparring, you self-correct because that
sure.
didn't work. But but in my practice, I didn't know how to self-correct until I finally had somebody teaching me the principles and what I'm aiming for, what I'm looking for.
Right.
And then I was able to, every time I did the form, I was making it a little bit better.
Yeah.
Not waiting. I didn't have to wait and go back and see him every time. I mean, I still had, you still do that, but I could start self-correcting, and that was just, a complete revelation for me.
Yeah.
Organizing around these principles and the clarity of intent. It's like, this
Yeah.
is what we're doing, and this is why we're doing it. Um,
Hugely important. And,
yeah.
I do a lot of analogy and metaphor because it's just how my brain works. But I think of Chinese martial arts as a jigsaw puzzle where you
Mhm.
have to have the picture on the box to know what you're trying to make. You have to have all the pieces to put together, but you have to make each piece before you can put it together. And
Mhm.
those are the shapes. And there isn't one shape, even Wuji, even the first basic standing shape, that doesn't require an awful lot of dropping in, recognizing how you're doing it versus how you're supposed to be doing it, and beginning to change the body so you can express the shape properly. And that is the whole thing. So to me, the value in doing that isn't about the fighting, it's about the body it creates, the health, because tension obfuscates not only the neural mapping of the body, but it blocks circulation. And I think whether it's an economy, a roadway, or a body, circulation is essential for health. And so we need things to be moving. And tension is just an activity of not allowing this to move through our body. So we have to recognize the holding on and begin to find a way to slowly let it go. The closed hand can't receive, right? We need to
Yeah.
open up to receive the energy around us. And, chi, everybody says, oh, what is chi, mystical, yada, yada. We're an energy the way a fish is in water. A fish doesn't know it's in water until you take it out of water. People don't realize that we are receiving energy until they get sick, and all of a sudden they notice, health is appreciated in its absence. We are always being energized by the world, but as we go through life, we tighten up against it. And so that tension is, in my opinion, the single biggest impediment to experiencing health and vitality.
And the connection to the rest of the living world,
Sure,
like you're
yeah.
saying. I mean, that is, we can we can almost make ourselves an isolated entity if we're tense enough.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's right.
I
And
mean, at
if you
least our
look at
experience
people,
of it.
if you look at people that are in that state of being psychologically, somebody who's detached from the world and all these other things, you will see a physicality that very much represents that mental state of being. And so, yeah, this is why this stuff becomes profound and spiritual, because you can't deal with changing your body without changing everything else, because you're not separate.
Yeah, yeah, and on a lot of levels. I mean, and even the realization that we actually can change our own programming, physically and emotionally, psychologically, et cetera, et cetera. Not saying it's easy, but it is
Yeah,
a it is
it's
it's part of
doable
what we do,
because we
and then
move out of habit.
yeah.
Right? Human beings are habitual movers.
Hmm.
And when we make things cortical, when we bring it up to the front of the brain, we can change it and we
Hmm.
can create new habits.
Hmm.
It's a lot, the older we get, the more work it is, but it's always doable. And so that's a profound thing. And, part of, I think, what's going on is we don't value the body. We don't value these things. And so we don't realize how much medicine we have within us if we learn how to think about it and use it. And so my big interest in all this, and we're sort of careening all over, but it's great fun, is is in this paradigm, is in this idea that we have the ability to transform our physical body and thereby our whole experience of the world. And the more we become able to recognize, feel into, and transform things by noticing, right? I mean, there's only awareness and choice, right? When we are aware of something, we can change it and choose something new. If we're not aware of it, we're stuck with it. So we have to bring our attention into ourselves. And from a healing standpoint, there's all these people that are in situations where they've lost feeling connection to their body. They're not able to really sense themselves. And so they go in and they get acupuncture or some body work or something. Oh, it doesn't work, didn't do anything. But if you can't bring your attention into your own body, how are you going to heal your body? So the first thing is learning to be aware of and feel our body clearly by bringing our attention into it. And that forms the basis for many more layers and levels of medicine that emerge just from that one simple activity.
I agree with you. To me, awareness is what's underneath all of it, and that's what separates, or to me, that's the crux of what I consider an internal practice.
Yeah.
Is that it's cultivating awareness. And then, I mean, one can that may be oversimplified, but even
I hear what you're saying, what you're pointing at. Yeah, I mean,
yeah,
it is true, and this is the challenge with all this stuff. It can all be
right,
misheard and oversimplified. It
yeah,
doesn't mean it's not still true, right? It's like that
right.
definition piece. Yeah,
And it doesn't need to be that for other people, but for me, that's what's so beautiful about it, and that's what makes it so rich.
yeah,
And I mean, there's a lot of things I love doing, but it's that interoception, that getting deep into the body, that finding tension and dissolving tension. And then, oh yeah, and then the structure spontaneously reorganizes, or,
yeah.
sometimes there's a seesaw going on there,
Hmm.
but how do I align without tension? How do I move without tension? And then
Yeah,
without the tension, you can feel things, and you can
yeah,
feel what's going on in my body. You can feel what's going on in your opponent or your partner's body. You can feel what's going on in the ecosystem around you. You can
hmm,
feel other things. And that's where, I should probably stop talking about it, but that's where things start to get a little, or seem mystical, or seem far-fetched, because, you know, um, you can develop a sensitivity to things. You can feel a slight twitch that most people would never register the information. You
yeah.
actually receive way more information through your body, and it counteracts the education, yeah, as you were saying.
That's right. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and we, oftentimes, so part of my experience has been, and I've had all kinds of iterations of my work in terms of trying to put it out there, but I used to use the term awakened embodiment. And
Hmm.
this was because this was my literal experience of like, oh, I didn't know I could do that, I didn't know I had that.
Right.
As we feel more and more, you become able to control parts of your body. So like for me, and this is part of when I was talking about tucking the tail and creating proper shapes, the ability to consciously control and move the lumbar vertebra of the spine is a fundamental thing. And it's demonstrable. You can do it, people can feel it, and people will be like, whoa, I can't do it, that's weird, I can't do that. But if you think about it, there's no part of your body that is any less you than any other part. So you should be able to feel and move just about everything. Granted, there's a homunculus, right? There's parts of the body that get more play in the brain, but we can, through practice, learn to develop and make distinctions within the body that are not common. But they're not common simply because people don't put the attention and effort into doing it. But that ability to fully inhabit your body and move it with these levels of detail and consideration is what the practice is about. It's fully pervading the body with the mind and awareness.
Hmm. Hmm. And I'm pretty convinced that we can change. I mean, the homunculus is always given, this kind of proportionality, but I, I'm convinced we can change that
Yeah,
proportionality. I mean, we saturate something with attention for long enough, you build a very detailed map with a lot of information.
I
Um,
certainly agree. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. I think
and it's an interesting thing that I mean, I've experienced this both in myself and from teaching movement and doing body work with people, just how much of, there's sensory motor amnesia is a word that's sometimes used to describe
yeah,
it,
yeah. Hannah's
but
whole premise.
yeah, but this whole concept, yeah, like you said, there's no part of you that's less you than
Right.
you.
Yeah,
And yet people refer to it, oh, I have a bad back, or I have a bum knee or whatever, and like
yeah,
the way we think about it, and the inability to make certain movements or certain directions, and just, or the inability to feel certain areas, you know.
yeah.
And
Yeah,
sometimes there's physical blockages, but very often it's more of a neuro, you know, kind of a neuromotor,
yeah, and
neuromuscular.
it's a chicken or egg kind of thing too, right?
Right.
It's like there will become physical issues that evolve out of the lack of having that part of the body incorporated into the whole.
Absolutely.
Um, and you know, the the fundamental standpoint of Chinese medicine and martial arts, in my opinion, is developing the capacity to feel the body clearly so you can lead the energy through your feeling awareness to the area that needs healing. And like super simple, but not easy, right? But that's what it is. Whatever is not getting circulation and movement and being incorporated into the rhythm and pulsation of the whole body will suffer for its isolation. So we have to be able to find our way into these areas. And so developing this capacity and consideration for the body of bringing our feeling awareness into it, this for me is the whole thing in Tai Chi. This is the whole thing in healing, is that when you empty out the tension, the body fills with chi or life force. So we
Mhm.
become buoyant, we become resilient because of that process. It's not me doing it, it is creating the conditions for life to flourish. And so this is all about feathering the nest or creating a space where the spirits want to dwell.
Nice. Nice. Well said. Yeah. Um, not to, we can always come back to that. I'm just thinking about how I love all this conversation about the Chinese internal arts and the principles and your elucidation of them. I can see very clearly why the clubs are a little easier for people to grasp with many of the same principles, many of the same lessons.
Yeah.
Clearly, it's not the same thing, but um, I'm sure you've been. I don't know what your opinion is of this, but I'm sure. Well, I think I actually might know your opinion. But there's a lot of old adages, about if you're studying the internal arts, especially the soft internal arts, you have to get rid of any old, external training. You have to get rid of the
Yeah,
white.
yeah.
Um, and there's different approaches, but there is physical training that will make you more relaxed and connected, and there's physical training that will make you more tense and disconnected.
Yeah.
And so, if you're clear on your goals, you can see what helps you move in that direction, et cetera, et
Yeah.
cetera.
So it's a great subject, and I'm glad you brought it up. So I've been swinging clubs for probably 12 or 13 years, but I always did it sporadically as an adjunct training to my martial arts. Oh yeah, this feels good, yada yada. When I moved back to the East Coast from Colorado, and I didn't have students here because I had moved to a new area, I didn't have anybody to push hands with, and so I got back into swinging clubs. And I think it's partially because I got far enough along in my own practice to have this realization, but I realized swinging clubs is exactly what pushing hands is. You attach, adhere, join, and follow. There is an object that I'm sticking to, and I'm not controlling. The club isn't actually being swung. It's my arm that's moving, and the club is relatively still in the hand, unless you're doing a moulinet or something like this. But what this has really led me to realize is club swinging and Tai Chi are both about uninterrupted, interconnected circles and the ability to take the weight into the body, absorb it into the bones, and transform it through changing shape and structure. And so they're absolutely the same activity for me at some level. And the beauty of the clubs is they're immediately tangible to everyone. And so they create a simple container to begin to explore these more fairly profound ideas, and so one thing I would say that I neglected strength for years because of what you just said, those admonitions. A weightlifting kind of thing, you see this in wrestling and boxing, and it's true to my experience. People that are tight from that, they're easy to throw around because they're all corners, and so that isn't the right kind of strength. But the club swinging is all about tendon and bone strength. And
Mhm.
like I swing, everything's relative. I'm not a huge guy and I'm not super strong and it's not my focus, but I can swing 20-pound clubs, which are pretty heavy and hard for people to swing. And it's not because I'm holding the club with my bicep. I let the weight of the club travel through my skeletal system down into the ground, and then I organize around the club. I'm not muscling the club.
Right.
And when you're swinging clubs, it is not, it should be super easy. The more the body moves, the less the joints are not doing their job. So you don't want compensation. You want stillness within the swinging. So you're not letting all this compensatory movement rob you of what you're actually trying to do, which is to get the joints and the bones to be expressing the movement, not the body moving around in space. So for me, club swinging, I have a whole way in which I practice and teach it. And it's all about building out what I call the interconnected body method, which is, so I study Tai Chi, Xingyi, and Bagua. My Xingyi teacher, I've had the most time and thorough, like that would be my root art. But my Bagua teacher and the Tai Chi that I learned with him, they're all the same. In other words, the methodology is entirely consistent, and it has to do with the mind stretching and engaging the tendons to create oppositional force in all the shapes. And this is exactly what's going on with the clubs. So the clubs build incredible hand strength, which then helps reorganize, this is the fruit, this is the root. If the fruit is sweet, the root will be strong. So they build each other. When the root of the shoulder gets strong, it starts to connect into the torso. My whole torso and posture has redefined itself in the last few years from club swinging. Again, though, I'm swinging clubs in a specific way that I understand through my martial art training.
Right. Right.
So it's fascinating. Strength counts, and it matters, and it feels good.
And I've done. I haven't. I mean, I've watched your club videos, and they're very well, they're beautiful, but that feels like there's a lot of intelligence in there. Clearly, it's very clear that you're doing. It's a deep practice, and there's a lot of understandings of what you're doing and not doing. I haven't worked with clubs the same way, but I've worked with a lot of different tools and toys, sometimes weapons, sometimes specific, and sometimes intentionally not weapons, just to feel the momentum. But the same idea of adding a little bit of weight sometimes makes the motion clearer. And for a few years there, this hasn't been for a while, but for a few years there, I got really into. I just really wanted to learn Tai Chi. I wanted to finally fucking get it. I wanted to really get it. And so I just got rid of all of my strength training stuff, or not. I mean, even just hard style stuff. I just really, really wanted to go soft. And this was through Chen Manqing's lineage. So it's very soft. I mean, it's cotton fist if there is such a thing. And a lot of my aspects of my Tai Chi got better, but I got weaker, and I just didn't like how I felt in my upper body anymore. And so I've done different things. I mean, the animal walks are a big part of that. Was something I counterbalanced my Tai Chi with, because I could still try to do as little as possible, and it was still focused on bone alignment stuff. But then using toys and tools for momentum, and even with teaching people how to do, just let their arms swing in a pendulum. It's like that for some people it's a very easy concept. For some people it's a very challenging concept. And if I put a 2-pound weight in their hand, suddenly they can feel enough and they'll actually let go and get out of the way. Or now it's the momentum is doing the thing, whereas before it's hard to
there's too much tension and confusion there. The feeling isn't sufficient,
So there's a weird paradox about sometimes having another little extra weight, a little extra momentum can actually help you get out of the way.
Well, and you think about like a pistol or something like that. If you're holding a kettlebell and you do a one-legged pistol, it's much easier than without one because it loads you. I've often said in the past, and I still think it's true, although I'd probably have a caveat if I thought about it at this point because my practice has changed a little bit. But to me, the most interesting thing about Chinese martial art, internal arts, and what makes it unique is it's a self-generated load. You're not doing anything. There's no external weight that requires you to really engage. Otherwise, you're going to be hurt. And the problem with that is that creates noise in the nervous system. So like if you're doing an activity that if you don't make it, you're going to fucking break your neck or you're going to get hurt, your body rallies in a way to save you, but that's not really conscious because you're going to a part of the brain that's like, I got to take over. And so with Chinese martial arts, Yi, the ability to put your hand out and create a lot of power and tension through that is a function of my mind in opening my hand. There's nothing else that's creating the need for it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, I think, what's really special about Chinese martial art is that you begin to be able to create the tension and the connection through your body by organization and oppositional force. Everything. So here's an analogy that I used a lot, both in describing the posture for club swinging and in martial arts. Your body is, it's like a tent. When you go out camping, you have a pile of fabric on the ground. There's nowhere to go until you take a line of force this way, and then a line of force this way, and then a line of force this way, and a line of force that way. That creates the empty space in which you get to sleep. We have to do the same thing in the body to empty it out and create the central channel. You have to be able to tuck the chin to raise the crown, tuck the tail to pull down the lower spine. The cranium and the sacrum are in constant communication. They are the number two, mirrored opposites. By being able to unify them, we take the slack out of the body by stretching the spine. By being able to maintain that through constant mindfulness of not losing those conditions, we build a kind of strength, mental and physical, that just compounds over time. The problem with teaching movement, especially detailed movement, is you can correct somebody and 2 seconds later they're doing what they were doing before. Why? Because we move habitually. It takes a lot of mental drive to undo the postural habits that feel correct. So you have to hold the idea in mind and have the will stay present to create the idea. It's mental, but it's physical. Yeah.
Well said. Yeah, it is. It's a lot. It's a lot. Like, you got to have that voice going over and over and over.
Yeah, yeah. And
What's your
it's
sacrum doing? What's your
constantly
shoulders
looking
doing?
for
Yeah,
it. Is it, yeah,
yeah,
is that,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
you're dialing it in all the time.
Yeah.
But by doing that, you're both building your ting, your listening, your song, your releasing, clearing the tissue, and your yi, your ability to direct your will to create the shape in your body that you want. And that process just builds and builds and builds. And I think that's what's truly unique about the Chinese arts. Now, clubs allow you to keep that same paradigm because, again, when I'm swinging clubs, I'm not really swinging the club. And a word that I've heard you use a couple times that I actually don't use in my practice is momentum. I don't want momentum because I'm not in control of momentum. Momentum can be taken away from me. So when I'm swinging a club, I'm controlling the club the whole way. I could stop at any point in that circle and be where I am. The same thing with the Tai Chi. If the momentum of the movement is causing the weight shift, it can be hijacked from you. Where, in my opinion, what I want is to be able to, it's like particle and wave, right? As soon as you look at it, it becomes a particle. When you're not looking at it, it becomes a wave. So you're moving, but you should be able to stop at any point and be in the stability of the posture. And so that's a interesting concept. It's not to say that momentum is never used. It's a fine distinction and is easier to point out in person. But in other words, if somebody, and you see this with clubs, people will use as much of their body as they can to get it going and then use the momentum. From my standpoint, that's not what I want to do because of the compensation involved and because of the fact that I'm not in control of the club. Now I have low ceilings and I have a dog that follows me and sits next to me all the time. So when I'm swinging clubs, I'm always very careful about if my dog walks up to me or something. And so like if you have a big heavy club and the momentum's taken over, you're in trouble. So it's a fine line, but it's an interesting consideration.
I get what you're saying. Yeah, there's probably more specific words that I can use for that because the momentum there's an impulse of momentum. There's a directionality of it.
To me, that's the phase shift, right? Things dense down and then they release into the other direction. And what I'm always trying to do is to, again, and this is yin and yang, right? I think of Tai Chi as just a philosophy about material. Anything that exists in the material world has a yin and yang to it, right? So That's the idea. And so things phase change. So when things gather all the way down to the density of the yin, it wants to explode back up to the yang. Can I be present at the explosion and contain and guide the expansion, and then feel the pressure there and bring it back? So it's like being able to stay with it as it's changing rather than kind of thing.
Yeah, no, I definitely get what I know what you mean by when people just generate the momentum and it's no longer in their control, or
Right.
and there is this fine dance, because I'll often, if I'm using an implement, I consider it my dance partner, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and
That's right.
so momentum may be the wrong word, but there's a, like, the location of impulse changes, you know.
Mm-hmm.
One
Mm-hmm.
moment it's in the core of my body, or through my root to the ground, and next moment it's out there with the implement,
Yeah,
et
you're
cetera, et cetera.
tracking the wave of movement.
Yes, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And
yeah.
one of the beautiful things about clubs and weapons is the same, is you're moving in relationship to something other than
Right,
yourself. And so you get direct feedback into the
right.
quality of your movement. Because if you're swinging a club and you feel yourself crashing into it, that's telling you about your tension. And that's what you need to clear out so you can actually let it all go, gather, release, gather, release. So it's a fascinating process. And all of this stuff is really, these hair splitting little distinctions in language and idea. And it's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, and even just the way you were talking about before, I mean, the clubs provide some of that need,
Mm-hmm.
there's a legitimate chance of hitting your dog or hitting your nose or head or whatever,
Yeah,
there's
yeah,
a,
yeah,
so that triggers that. It takes some of the pressure off, what you were talking about with, to create the intention, have the will to keep it in mind when I'm doing these subtle changes that'll have
yeah,
to all self be generated. Well, now you have feedback, like it actually takes some of the pressure off to
yeah.
create the feedback loop without such intense focus.
That's
Um,
right. Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. And it helps to load the bones, load the
Hmm.
skeleton. I have an idea, which is part of the reason that we have so many people that get bone depletion and bone loss as they age is because tension. If you're
Hmm.
tight, the force of gravity doesn't drop through the bone. It gets bounced off the tight tissue. And so like we need to absorb force. Tai Chi and clubs is the same. If you push on me, I want that force to come into my body and to load my bones. So when I release, that's what goes back out, just like a heavy pair of clubs or even a light pair of clubs. You
Hmm.
feel the weight. You have to eat it. You have to take it into your body, into your
Hmm.
bones, and down into the ground. So every time you're swinging, the momentum generated from the clubs has to be balanced against the stability of the body. So you can notice relative motion. If I'm still in my body, with the exception of the swinging of the club, my brain can say, oh, here's a clear distinction. Nothing's moving but what's moving. And I can really see what's meant to be moving versus all this other peripheral noise due to the lack of stability and stillness. And so it's neurologically super juicy, and it gives you all this stuff to work with. But these distinctions and dichotomies we have to set up through our training, so we give ourselves a chance to make these differentiations.
That's interesting. So when you're working with the clubs, you're not trying to have whole body unified movement.
Sometimes, so as I teach two body methods. One I call the static body method, where
Hmm.
my goal is to move as little as I can and just swing the club. And what that causes is a whole body torso connection from the top of the head down to the feet. This builds strength and stability. Then there's the harmonizing body method, which is more like Tai Chi, where everything is moving together and they're harmonized. But the latter really depends on the former. In other words, without doing the stabilized body method first, a lot of people will be trying to move everything together, but it's like Tai Chi. Yeah, pieces are coordinated, but they're not expressing the same thing. And
Yeah.
one thing I didn't say that I should, because it's simple and it's clear, in my opinion, Tai Chi and Chinese martial arts, you have to unify the three sections of the body: legs, torso, arms. The three sections compose 5 bows: 2 arms, 2 legs, and a torso. Each of the 5 bows has 3 subsections: wrist, elbow, shoulder, hip, knee, ankle, cervical, thoracic, lumbar. Those are the 9 joints. What we're trying to be able to do is to take a force into the body, so when the push comes here, it's also registered here in the torso and in the legs. So they all move the same amount for the same purpose. So when it's released, you get the compounding of the bows to create the force. So there's this whole body thing that has to happen like this. And that is different from simply coordinating the sections. You have to have the relative centers of each section in communication. So everything is moving from center to periphery in an actual singular action.
Very clearly said. Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, simple, but not easy.
Right,
So
right.
it's like that. It's not, you know, it's hard enough to do. The definitions of what we're doing and the practices need to be clear, because the work just takes time through repetition, but the work shouldn't be a mystery. And that was my challenge in martial arts for a long time. I was never really clear. I kind of thought I knew. I read, when I was in my 20s, I read every book you could imagine on this stuff. I was really obsessed with it. And I thought I knew, but then it turns out I didn't really know.
That's how it goes.
Yeah. And I'm grateful for that, you know. But yeah, and so it's the same thing with the clubs. You're trying to get this expression of K gathering together, Kai opening out and away, and just bringing it back and forth over and over. So you're circulating the energy through these 5 sections of the body, or 5 bows, 3 sections. And that's what's washing the tissues to make them soft. That's what's giving nourishment to the cells. So you become this whole body pump. And that whole body pump is what really keeps creating the conditions and transforming the tissue into softer, more elastic kind of a quality, like kneading bread.
Yeah. I like that idea of the whole body pump.
Yeah, it's profound and it feels amazing. I mean, that's
yeah.
the other thing I love about clubs is it's just so bloody fun. I mean, I have so much fun doing it, and other people too, right? They try it and they love it. It feels good right away. You start to get stronger. You get your joints moving better. It's a really nutritious practice. And so I've been putting together a whole curriculum of development based on Chinese martial arts principles of how to use the clubs. I'm convinced they existed in the Chinese traditions at some point in time, and you can see some evidence toward that, but I'm not a huge history, I don't need to prove that point. I don't really care. But I do suspect so. And so yeah, there's a huge crossover there, and the crossover is a function of being focused on Shinfa, or body method, the means whereby you're trying to generate the force and how you're trying to organize and use the body.
Nice. I think it's time starting to
yeah. This has been
soon.
fun though.
This has been great. I've really enjoyed this.
Likewise.
Yeah, and I mean, we talked a little bit before because we hadn't really interacted that much.
Yeah. I've seen your stuff and seen you through Simon's group and some other stuff. But I've always been curious, and I'm delighted to have a chance to sit face to face.
This has been a blast. And I really appreciate how clear and articulate you are about all these principles. Anything you want to, before we leave? We'll definitely let you know how to get in touch with you, that sort of thing. But any thoughts as well?
So I run Island Physical Culture out here on Martha's Vineyard. I'm doing a lot of teaching right now. I'm just down in Florida. I'm going out to Colorado next month. Probably going to California the month after that. Excuse me. My interest is in teaching this idea of an integrated body method, which, you know, the terminology that I tend to use is this idea of postural strength, which is the idea of being able to use the skeletal structure like the frame of a drum, and use the mind to be able to pull the tissue across the frame of the drum through balanced opposition in all the directions. This leads to what's called an interconnected body method. And this is the terminology from the Bagua and the Xingyi, where it doesn't matter the shape, everything is strong by virtue of the connectedness of the parts and pieces. And so you're always having to have evenness. If a force comes on you, the point is to not let it build up in one place, but to actually be able to distribute it across the whole frame of the body so that it doesn't become too much work, and then changing around that. So Island Physical Culture is my website. And what I'm really keen on is getting especially the clubs out there, because the clubs are an entry point into all this deeper information, which just takes time. There's no way to speed up the changing of the body, right? You're talking about changing tissue literally. It's not
Yeah.
intellectual. One of the biggest challenges for martial artists is a lot of people think somebody's going to tell them something that will make them a better fighter. It's a physical endeavor. You're changing your body, and that takes time. And what you need is to be staying within the eye of someone who's gone through the work so they can help lead you toward it. It's not about new information. It's about fine-tuning things deeper and deeper. So yeah, I'm really excited to share this stuff and get it out there. Yeah, I think this is really what we need right now. I mean, this reconsideration of what it is to be in a body, realizing that, you know, you're not your body like you're not your house, but it's nice to have a good one, right?
Yeah, yeah. No, I agree. There's a lot of profundity to the work
Yeah.
of embodiment from, you know, from many different perspectives. But yeah,
Without a doubt. Without
been
a
a
doubt.
pleasure. Been a pleasure, my
Likewise.
friend.
Thank
All
you,
right.
my friend, and I'll see you on the social media world.
Yeah, man. See you soon.
All right. Take good care. Bye.
Bye.